Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Ostigo and I'll be your MC for today. Welcome to our Mental Health Week live stream. Today, we're tackling the complex and multifaceted issue of burnout, exploring the importance of structure and cultural causes rather than individual wellness initiatives in addressing workplace burnout. I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we are speaking to you from today and on which you are learning and working from today. I'd also like to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people watching today. Mental Health Week is held nationally every October to raise awareness of the importance of psychologically safe and healthy workplaces and contributes to driving behaviour and attitudinal change in reducing stigma and discrimination of mental ill health. If you need support or something you hear today affects you, please consider employing psychological self-care strategies that you typically find helpful. Connect with a peer or manager, contact your employee assistance provider, or your regular health professional. Support channels and numbers are now on the screen, and we'll drop them in the chat for you as well. And remember, you can call Lifeline at any time on 13 11 14. Whilst there has been heightened focus on wellbeing and mental health, burnout continues to grow across the globe. Our speakers today will share the latest finding from the 2022 Global Burnout Study and discuss the misalignment between much hyped burnout prevention strategies and the root causes of burnout. We will hear some practical advice on what organisations can do to drive the attraction and retention of staff through burnout mitigation. I'm very pleased to welcome our distinguished guest this afternoon. We have Dr. Chan, who is the Managing Director at Infinite Potential, a non-for-profit think tank focused on workplace research. John is an industrial and organisational psychologist with 20 plus years of global experience designing people strategies that transform workplaces to empower individuals to realise their whole potential. John's career has taken him from Silicon Valley startups to NYSE and ASX 100 companies. John publishes in academic and media publications and regularly speaks at national and international conferences. We're thrilled to have him here this afternoon. And we're also really keen to introduce and welcome Sally Clarke, who is joining us all the way from the Netherlands. Sally is co-director at Human Leaders and a wellbeing and burnout expert, researcher and speaker. Sally is a former finance lawyer and author of 2 books on burnout, and she has lived on 4 continents. Her mission is to fight for burnout prevention and help people live authentic and fulfilling lives. As always, there will be an opportunity today to ask questions to our panellists and our presenters. I ask that you please drop those questions in the chat box throughout the talk so that we don't miss them. Welcome, Dr. Chan and Sally. I'm going to hand over now to John. So John, let's kick it off.
Great, thanks so much for that great introduction. Hi, everybody. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I work and live, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We acknowledge that this land was never ceded, always is, always will be Aboriginal land. So I'd like for you to kind of imagine for a moment here. A person waking up in the morning and is already exhausted at the thought of all the work that they have to get through today. Or maybe a person going through the motions at work and wondering if they made the right career choice in a profession that they once loved. A person not able to concentrate at work, is easily distracted or irritated by their colleagues at work. Or maybe a person getting a slight cough or a scratchy throat, and their first sense is one of relief, that if they get sick, they might actually be able to take some time off. Now, many of us have experienced or know someone who have experienced burnout. For a person experiencing burnout, the only thing on their to-do list is to get through the day. Now, these symptoms not only have a great impact on the individual, but also for the organization and for our society as a whole. Now, burnout is all around us. Now, burnout is on the minds of many organizations and leaders, and they in turn have poured a whole lot of resources into trying to solve this issue. Across the globe, 4 in 5 leaders report that mental health and well-being is a top priority for their organization. And 9 out of 10 organizations around the world offer some form of wellness program. But even with all of this attention and resources going into addressing this issue, burnout continues to grow year after year. So why is that? In today's talk, Sally and I will explore the root causes of burnout and what we might be getting wrong about the solution to this problem. We'll also share some of the latest findings from our Global Burnout Study and provide some practical advice on how to tackle this issue. Again, my name is John, and I'm an organizational psychologist. I head up Infinite Potential, and our purpose is to help organizations create environments that can bring out the full potential in their employees and their people. And I believe that alleviating burnout is one of the most critical issues that organizations and us as society are facing today, not only for the health of our people, but also as a key to unlocking productivity and innovation.
My name is Sally Clarke. I'm co-director of People-Centered Leadership Movement, Human Leaders, and I'm also an author, speaker, and a coach and culture consultant. My latest book, Relight Your Spark, guides individuals on how to heal and evolve after burnout. And before we delve into, imagining a world without burnout, I wanted to share a photo of me that was taken in late 2009. And it symbolizes how I felt at the time. So I was working as a finance lawyer at a top European firm. To the outside world, I'd made it. I was 31. I was in a role that graduates from Oxford and Cambridge vie for. My business card basically said success. And at the same time, I was utterly miserable. I was working 70 to 80-hour weeks. My relationships were failing. I felt really isolated and unsupported by the firm, especially the partners I was working for. My health was becoming compromised. I was getting stress rashes. I was losing weight. I was barely sleeping, and my self-confidence was at an all-time low. But because of the prestige associated with this role, I persisted. Several months after this photo was taken, I was flying to visit my brother in Nantes, France. He was living there at the time. And when I walked into the arrivals hall at Nantes airport and laid eyes on Andrew, I collapsed to the floor. I started crying and I couldn't stop. Looking back, I can see that I was in a deep, dark burnout. At the time, I was reluctant to use the term, as it seemed to signify some kind of failure on my part. My thinking was, everyone else seems to be coping fine. There must be something wrong with me. And this is one of the tricky things about burnout. Because we still have the mistaken idea that it results from personal failure, we keep pushing and trying and desperately willing things to be okay, even when they are most definitely not okay. So burnout impacts us as individuals, but it also impacts us collectively at a team, organizational, and even societal level. And burnout is an issue we really cannot afford to ignore. Burnout's demanding action. And even though exact figures are very difficult to establish, estimates of its impact range in the billions of dollars globally. Research shows that experiencing burnout makes people 2.6 times more likely to leave their current employer. And 40% of people who changed their jobs in 2021 listed burnout as the reason for leaving. So this means that at a time when retention and turnover are huge issues for organizations around the world, forward-thinking leaders who proactively work to prevent burnout will see potentially huge returns on those efforts. And burnout isn't just affecting organizations, it's affecting industries.
Burnout is detrimental for the individual. I think Sally's story really well illustrates that, but it really has broader consequences that affects all of us. As Sally just mentioned, burnout has been cited as the primary driver for people changing jobs in the last couple of years. A recent study from McKinsey shows that those who have changed jobs, they're also changing industries or not returning to the workforce at all. Now, we've all seen this in the education, in healthcare, in retail, hospitality sectors. And for those industries, those who have left, they're never going back to that industry. They've lost them for good. And this gap that it creates affects all of us. Anybody who's trying to take a flight recently, you guys will know that, or trying to book at a restaurant. The impact of burnout is broad. And so it's really important for us to take a holistic and also a societal view on how do we approach this and how do we tackle this problem together. There's been a lot of coverage on burnout recently from the media, different professions, endless groups offering solutions to alleviate burnout. In order to solve this issue, we need to make sure that we have the same definition and are all talking about the same thing. And in 2019, the World Health Organization did just that. They defined burnout as a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. So this means that burnout is caused by organizational structures and cultures that is creating chronic stress in individuals. What this definition also means is that burnout refers to an experience specific to work, and it shouldn't be used to describe what a person might be experiencing in their personal life. Now, this doesn't mean that a person can't experience extreme levels of life stress, negativity, or disengagement outside of work, but that's something different, and that's not burnout. If you only take away one thing from today's discussion, please take this away. Burnout is the result of workplace stress, and it's not the fault of the individual that they're going through burnout. And the solution to burnout is not to target individuals. Trying to address burnout with individually targeted solutions like resilience training or time management training, something like that, will do very little if the person is stuck in this toxic work environment. Now, to address burnout, we really need to address the ways of working and these cultures that are creating unmanageable stress in individuals. Now, when it comes to burnout and how we define it, there are three dimensions that makes up burnout. The first dimension is the feeling of physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion. Now, this is the most notable and probably the one we're most familiar with. The second dimension is increased feelings of disengagement or mental distance from your work. So this is sometimes described as this increase in cynicism or feelings of negativity towards a job that you may have once really loved to do, but now are just kind of dread going to. And finally, the third dimension is reduced professional efficacy, which is a difficulty in concentrating and performing at the level that you know you're able to. Everything just seems harder to do. Everything takes longer. You're just not into it, and you feel as you're just not doing your best work. One thing I'd like to point out is that to be experiencing burnout, a person must be experiencing all three dimensions. So just being really exhausted or being disengaged in your current role doesn't mean you're experiencing burnout. It's a combination of all three of these factors that creates a state of burnout in an individual.
Burnout is a spectrum, and we're all on it, even if we're right on the end where we're not feeling burnt out or experiencing burnout at all. And no alarm automatically goes off when we shift from experiencing chronic stress and cross that threshold into burnout. It is a subtle and insidious process. It can be invisible to those around us and sometimes even to ourselves. Chronic stress puts us in a heightened state of alert for prolonged periods, and our bodies were not designed for these ongoing states of stress. They take a toll on our physical, physiological, emotional, and mental well-being. Stress causes our focus to narrow, which means that being in burnout reduces our objectivity and our ability to make healthy decisions for our own well-being. And this is why once we are shifting along that spectrum of burnout, it can be a dangerously slippery slope. Now, burnout is not a bad day or a tough week. Burnout, as we've noted, is caused by chronic workplace stress, which by its nature is low level and can fester for months or even years before you realized, or as I was, confronted with the fact that there's a problem. So burnout is caused by chronic workplace stress, but what causes chronic workplace stress? Based on our research, we've identified 10 factors at organisational and team level. And in terms of the organisational factors, I'd like to highlight 3. The first is poor senior leader role modeling. So senior leaders directly influence how an organisation operates in its culture. They need to take the lead in creating a culture of wellbeing and transparency by living and breathing healthy behaviour, having healthy boundaries and habits, such as not emailing on weekends or out of office hours, talking about the dangers of burnout, and providing visible support and frameworks for change. Senior leaders and stakeholders have to make wellbeing a strategic imperative. When employees don't hear from senior leaders, or if they see them saying one thing and doing another, they won't believe wellbeing initiatives are anything more than PR. Another is a lack of support structures and guidelines. To end burnout, leaders need to create initiatives that investigate and reframe structures. So, for example, job design, so that we can really embed wellbeing in how we work. So making sure that our workload is manageable, expectations are realistic, and rest guidelines are implemented to prevent chronic stress from arising. Another is structural under-resourcing. Do more with less is a common corporate mantra for efficiency, but it often seeds burnout. For many organisations, downsizing and reorganisations are the norm, especially during economic crises. But budget cuts can lead to greater long-term costs through under-resourcing. Say, for example, 3 jobs are consolidated into 2, and the additional workload causes one of these people to experience chronic stress and start to burn out. As burnout develops, their efficiency is decimated to the point where maybe the team starts to miss targets, multiple targets. By ensuring job role design is specific, realistic, and sustainable, and allocating resources accordingly, senior leaders can lower costs and increase productivity and quality of work over the longer term.
There are also team factors that contribute to stress in the workplace. So I'll just highlight a couple here as well. First one I'll highlight is unreasonable time pressure. Now, we all work within time constraints, but when deadlines are unreasonable and excessive and unending, this creates a pressure cooker environment that fosters burnout. Now, leaders really need to understand what it means for their team when they agree to work, and they must be willing to push back when deadlines are unreasonable. Now, I know this is a lot easier to say than done, especially when it comes to deadlines with external clients. But this is the difference in creating a healthy versus a toxic work environment. Another factor I'll talk about is unmanageable workload or having too much to do. I think this is oftentimes the main thing that people bring up as their major stress within work. The workload, and when they say workload, that it can take a variety of forms. It can be just too much work. It can be having to go to too many meetings. It could be an excessive number of administrative tasks, or maybe a number of tasks that's just not a good use of a person's time. Research shows that the risk of burnout increases significantly when a person exceeds an average of 50 hours a week. Later in our discussion, I'll provide a few recommendations on how we might address this issue. Another root cause of burnout at the team level is unfair or inequitable treatment. Now, this can be seen in different ways within a team. It could include bias, favoritism, or mistreatment. Pay inequity or unfairness in the distribution of work are often experienced by minorities or underrepresented populations, which adds another level of intersectionality that needs to be addressed within the workplace. And so, as I mentioned before, many organizations are investing a lot into wellness benefits, such as training on time management and resilience, lunchtime yoga sessions, and meditation apps, and all kinds of nice things to fix their burnout problems. They do this because they believe that the person is the root of the burnout problem. Now, as you listen to this list and kind of read through this list of root causes of burnout, you might begin to see where the disconnect is and why current well-being initiatives might not be addressing the root causes of burnout. High rates of burnout is a powerful signal that the organization, not the individuals, need to undergo meaningful systematic change. we really need to change this conversation so that when there is burnout happening within an organization, what leaders within that organization needs is to look at the culture and the ways of working within that organization, and not just about, oh, how can we fix the individuals that are in there. Now, for the last 3 years, Infinite Potential has been conducting a global longitudinal research on burnout. We have had over 8,000 participants from over 30 countries participate in the study. We've just concluded this year's study, and we're in the midst of analyzing the data. However, we wanted to take this chance to share some initial findings with you that are just hot off the press. So we asked participants to rate their overall well-being from 0 to 100, 100 being fully engaged and energized. And for the 3rd year in a row, we continue to see a drop in this number. For the first couple of years, we had hypothesized that maybe the low well-being score was affected by COVID. And while it may still have an effect on this number, there is something else that's going on that's driving this continual drop. As COVID has really moved a little bit more into the background. And using the WHO definition of burnout, we've created the Infinite Potential Burnout Scale that measures the 3 dimensions of burnout. What we're seeing once again is that the percentage of people experiencing burnout is continuing to rise. So last year, the study showed around 34.7% of the participants was experiencing burnout, so all 3 of those dimensions. And this year, it has jumped to 38.1%. Not surprisingly, there's a high negative correlation between burnout and well-being. Other trends that we've seen in this year's study is, actually, this is all 3 years, is that women are still being more affected by burnout than men. But interestingly, our research have found that having caring responsibilities did not increase the likelihood of burnout. This is a bit counterintuitive to what most of us may think or are experiencing ourselves. But when we talk to individuals about this, it seems that caring responsibility acted as a protective barrier to burnout by giving the individual something that has a higher priority to focus on than work. What we've also seen from this year's study is that the age group that is experiencing the highest level of burnout has dropped. So in the previous couple of years, it was the 35 to 44 age group that was experiencing the highest level of burnout. This year, it's the 25 to 34 age group that is experiencing the highest level of burnout. This is a trend that we really need to keep an eye out on, as this shows that burnout is happening earlier in a person's career. And if we, and as you guys all understand the effect burnout has on an individual, this can have really long-term consequences for our society in general. And finally, this is a really interesting one as well. An insight that we found in the study showed that working from home over 80% of the time reported the highest level of burnout, while those working from the office or the store or your office location outside of your home over 80% of the time reported the lowest levels of burnout. Now, while correlation doesn't equate to causation, this is something to keep an eye on as well. And this is a really interesting insight to add on to the hybrid working conversation.
So a few of these findings that we had this year that we wanted to share as well. We'll go into greater depths in the report that we're preparing, which will be published next month on all of these points and more. But for me, one of the things that stood out was a very highly negative correlation between psychological safety and all 3 burnout dimensions. Psychological safety also positively correlates with engagement, levels of organizational support, and sense of belonging. So organizational behavioral scientist Amy Edmondson first introduced the construct of team psychological safety in the 90s and defined it as a shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. So this means that you are able to share and challenge ideas and provide and receive feedback within your team without fear of negative repercussions. So in other words, when we, and leaders in particular, work to create an atmosphere of trust, reliability, consistency, and respect within teams. This improves engagement, a sense of belonging, and being supported, and it also significantly can reduce burnout. And in 2022, our research has also found that organisational support is highly negatively correlated with all three burnout dimensions. So organisational support is the degree to which employees believe that their organisation values their contributions, cares about their well-being, and fulfills their socio-emotional needs. So creating an environment of psychological safety is an important way of delivering organisational support, and there are other ways too, and we'll delve into these more deeply in the report coming out next month. Another standout, as John mentioned, is this decrease in age at which people are experiencing burnout. We're really curious as to the reasons that in 2022, more younger people are experiencing burnout and the implications of this for the workplace and for society. And we will explore this in greater length in the report as well, once I've had some time to reflect on the data and delve into it more deeply. Our data suggests that many people are not feeling recognised or valued by their managers, their colleagues, and even their organisation at large. They feel unable to share ideas and feedback and unable to be their authentic selves at work, which creates disengagement, reduces their sense of belonging, and makes them more likely to enter into burnout. So given the enormous impact of burnout on individuals, teams, and organisations, what can we do to prevent burnout from happening before we get to this place? So we've seen an explosion of wellness initiatives in recent years, and these might include meditation apps, free yoga classes, gym memberships, and maybe an annual company-wide day off. While wellness initiatives are an important part of an employee value proposition, I speak as a certified yoga and meditation teacher when I say wellness initiatives do not prevent burnout. And that's because their focus is on the individual, when the causes of burnout, as we've outlined, are structural and cultural. There is a temptation, I think, when we're talking about burnout to push responsibility back onto individuals. Manage your time better, meditate more, be more resilient. And it might seem logical because burnout happens to individual people. It's also often convenient for senior leadership as it absolves them of responsibility to address the deeper issue. But it doesn't end burnout because it doesn't get to the root cause, these structural and cultural issues which we identified earlier. So a 2019 Harvard study found that wellness programs had no impact on overall employee health. And this kind of window dressing can actually be counterproductive. To say, for example, a company gives everyone a day off, but then they return to the same environment of overwork and overload. Another company installs a volleyball court on the roof of the office, which goes unused and becomes symbolic of the hypocrisy of senior management when it comes to employee mental health. Now, we are not suggesting organisations ditch wellness initiatives. They can be an important component of your value proposition, and they can contribute to factors such as psychological safety and belonging. And I remain a huge proponent of meditation and yoga, and wellness initiatives can form a helpful bonus on top of a healthy culture and systems that embed well-being and eradicate chronic stress in the workplace. Wellness initiatives will not solve burnout nor turnover issues. We need to have a healthy culture and systems in place first and foremost. So what is the answer? In 2021, we asked respondents what would most reduce their exposure or alleviate their work-related stress. And we were curious whether they were after free lunches, maybe more meditation apps, or a volleyball court on the roof. And it turns out they're not. The responses evidence an ongoing disconnect, as John mentioned, this disconnect between what people want and need and the superficial and ultimately ineffective responses we're seeing many organisations offer. As long as leaders ignore these messages from people, burnout will prevail. So the top 3 responses we had for what organisations can do were embed wellness as part of the business strategy and culture, review role responsibilities to ensure workload is manageable, increase manager capability to understand burnout and identify stressors, manage your actions, have a better understanding of the team's workload, push back on unrealistic expectations from clients and stakeholders, champion and role model wellbeing behaviours, protect weekends and days off, no work or contact over the weekends and days off. And the actions generally that will most alleviate levels of stress were ability to take a mental health day without question, receive more recognition from leaders, and allocate time to learn new skills and capabilities. So given the causes that we've identified and the solutions that people say they want, what's a practical example of making meaningful change at this structural level that leaders can actually action right now? So as John mentioned earlier, we've decided to take the root cause of unmanageable workload and unpack it a little bit as to what we can do right now. And while exact solutions will depend heavily on the kind of work you do, where you do it, and your existing organisational culture, we'll work through a few examples of steps you can take to shift culture, and starting with meetings. So making change in meetings is a really great place to start. It frees up time for what Cal Newport describes as deep work. In other words, periods of focused work. Between March 2020 and March 2022, meetings have increased by 288%. Let's just think for a minute what that practically means for our schedules. So a shift to remote and hybrid ways of working may have required some more structure for collaboration, because we can't just run into each other in the office as we may have done before. So we've definitely seen an uptick in Zoom and team requests. But this is resulting in people being left with little to no room in their schedule to do their actual work. So some ideas, maybe establishing some guidelines for meetings, set expectations in advance, be clear about the purpose of the meeting, start on time and end on time. Fight the urge on FOMO. If you aren't 100% sure you need to be at the meeting, say no. Resist the temptation for making 1 hour meetings standard, so going with 20, 30 or 45 minutes. Experiment with blocking whole afternoons or introducing no meeting Fridays, as some companies have done, to allow for deep work at these times. You can also look into walking or standing meetings and really encouraging people in your team to say no when there's really no good reason for them to be in a meeting.
When I work with organizations, this usually comes up as one of the key things that they want to kind of discuss, because it's such a complicated issue for organizations. You know, at the same time, they want to be able to manage people's workload, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And one of the examples, one of the practical strategies that I want to share with you is a simple exercise that you can do with yourself and your manager, or maybe if you're a manager, do with your team for a week. So at the beginning of each day, write down the priorities for that day. Then at the end of the day, write down what or who interrupted your work that day. Write down anything that might have helped you get your work done more efficiently. So perhaps you were missing some information from someone, or maybe there's some training on a particular topic that would have made your work a lot easier and a lot more efficient to do. Or maybe there was some red tape that needed to be removed so you can actually get the work that you wanted to get done. And after the week is up, review and discuss this with your manager or your team. So kind of discuss, are you and your manager or your team on the same page in terms of what are the priorities that was important for each for that week? Do you agree with how your team responded to those interruptions? You know, be very clear with them about when is it okay for them to say no and push back when they're being interrupted. We all want to say yes and make people happy. In general, that's sort of our nature, but it is imperative for leaders to really be able to kind of protect their team by giving them the support and giving them the knowing that it's okay for them to say no. If this is not a priority for them, that they can say no, and that their manager will back them up on that. This conversation can be really useful for you and your team to both understand what is going on, what is the workload, and to help everyone better able to manage the workload. The other recommendation I have is to allow for rest during the day. So a lot of, don't wait until you or your team is suffering from stress or burnout symptoms before allowing yourself to rest. Now, I think I was guilty of this for quite a while. I will rest on the weekend, or maybe, I'll just work really hard and I'll take a holiday in a couple of months and I'll rest then. Or, one thing I've heard, funny enough, talking to somebody on the plane is, I'm working really hard now, but I'm about to retire, so I'll rest then when I retire. There's always an excuse on not resting right now. But I really would implore that this is a very good strategy for, and habit to take up for both yourself and your teams. A couple of recommendations on allowing for rest. The first is to ban multiple back-to-back meetings. That's not useful. It actually doesn't provide anyone with the best outcome. As Sally just mentioned, fight this urge to have to be in these meetings and really experiment with meeting times. It doesn't have to be 60 minutes. There's no rhyme or reason that they are 60 minutes other than it's kind of easy to do. Try 45, give everyone 15 minutes in between to be able to rest. And another thing with that is don't eat lunch at your desk. Use that time to have a break, and stop all these lunch and learns. If it's something that's really important for someone and that they really need to learn it, do it during the rest of the day. Don't do it during lunch. Allow lunch to be a time, or lunchtime to be a time when people can have for themselves and to recharge. Another recommendation is to have your team or yourself block out the last 30 minutes before the end of their day. So this time should be used to finish up whatever needs to get done for the day. So don't start anything new. For that last 30 minutes, it's purely to finish up any of those emails you've started but haven't hit send yet, or finish the last piece of work, so that when the time when it's time to go, you've got that transition, you've got the wind down, and you're ready to go. And that creates both a timely on a physical and also a mental block that, yep, I'm warming down, and I'm ready to go at the time. And finally, create policies to protect times for rest. Now, these policies doesn't have to be company-wide, or it doesn't have to be a massive thing. It can be just between you and your team. So, for example, your team can agree on not answering emails during the weekend or when somebody's on holiday. Make it clear that you value this time for resting. And for leaders, it's especially important to role model these behaviors. Don't send emails over the weekend or late at night. For some, I understand, that is the time when it's good for them to work, and that's when they do have the time to do these things. If that is the case, you can use rules on Outlook or Google so that the email doesn't go out until Monday. There's a lot of research that goes out on when leaders do these emails, and both the stress and also the time that a team picks up the email and actually starts thinking about it, and the detrimental effect that causes. If it doesn't have to be done in the middle of the night, actually it shouldn't be done in the middle of the night, but try not to email during that time as well.
So we understand that when you're getting this information and hearing this pretty strong data around the extent of burnout, and also hearing that the causes are cultural and structural, it's natural, I think, to respond with a sense of overwhelm. How do we get started? It can almost cause some paralysis, I think. We sort of get stuck in inaction. And for John and I, it's really important to empower you with some practical starting points and maybe even some inspiration to open a conversation with your colleagues or leaders today. So get together and look at why your team or why you and your colleagues might be experiencing chronic stress. Which team and organisational root causes are affecting you and your team most? And what can you do to change these? to prevent chronic stress in the workplace from occurring. So here are some questions as a suggestion to start a robust discussion. How do we treat employee mental health and wellbeing as a strategic priority? Find some concrete examples, and if you can't find them, develop them. What are we doing to address outdated rituals, routines, practices, or processes that are causing stress in our people? And what habits maybe could we better do without? Are we holding leaders accountable for taking action on burnout and being healthy role models? If so, how? If not, what can we do to create accountability? How are we ensuring there's a stigma associated with people asking for help or taking rest? How can we make our environment more psychologically safe and help people feel more supported? What are the metrics we'll use to help guide our thinking and measure the effectiveness of our wellbeing initiatives? And I'd ask you to reflect on this question with me right now. What do we see when we imagine a workplace without burnout? What will the advantages of a workplace without burnout be for us as humans, including as parents, as partners, as friends, and other non-work roles, but also as teams, as an organisation, and as a society? And what will it take to get us there?
So thank you, everybody, for spending the time with Sally and I today. The last thing we want to leave you with is this. There are no quick fixes or silver bullets to extinguishing burnout. Now, there's not going to be a mandate or a directive or a legislation that's going to instantly solve burnout. What we need is a movement to change the way that we work and think about how we work as well. So a movement starts with an emotion, just general dissatisfaction with the status quo and a broad sense that no one is going to address the problem. This brewing discontent begins to turn into a movement when there's a voice that provides a positive vision and a path forward. That voice is heard, and with the first person echoing and amplifying that voice, we now have the beginning of a movement. And movements typically start small. They begin with a group of passionate, enthusiastic people who deliver a few modest wins. These small wins demonstrate to others that there is a better way, that a better way is possible. And these small wins create ripples that just get bigger and bigger until it can't be ignored. So I like to challenge everyone here today to be the person that provides that voice in your organization or within your team, to be able to improve the work environment for yourselves and your colleagues. Now, be the leader that creates an environment where people can grow and thrive in, not simply survive. Start small and let those wins grow into a movement. Thank you.
John and Sally, thank you so much for that presentation. Sally, thank you for sharing your personal experience, which kind of drove you to this field of work. And John, thank you so much for your insights. I think for me, absolutely a couple of key reflections that came from the presentation. And the first one is that, burnout is absolutely a workplace issue, and that we need to look at the work environment as opposed to the individual. And I often think about this as a fish in a fishbowl. And so if we have a fish in a dirty fishbowl and we take out the fish and clean it and put it in, we're not creating that opportunity for the fish to thrive. And so really to address that kind of situation, we need to look at how do we clean the fishbowl so that the fish can thrive as opposed to focusing on the individual. I think one thing that struck out for me as well from some of those practical tips was the reflections on meetings and that significant increase. And I know that in my work, when I'm engaging with organisations, I often hear that I've been in back-to-back meetings as a bit of a badge of honour almost in terms of being busy and translating that to being productive. And so really thinking, well, what is the impact of that on me as an individual? And the research on, just the process of being in those meetings and the impact that has on our well-being. And I think, one of my tips that I often think for, as a senior leader is, what's the decision I need to make in this meeting, or what's the input that you need from me in this meeting? And, if you can't answer that, then why do you need me, and why am I there? And so I think absolutely a few key reflections and strategies that has come from that presentation today. We do have a few questions from the audience, and I'll go to those first before I ask a couple. But the first one is from Alice for Sally, and Alice is trying to ask Sally and understand a little bit more about the difference between burnout and depression. And I was wondering if you could please provide us some insights into maybe what some of those distinguishing factors are.
Certainly, Alice, thank you for the question. And I'm not a medical professional, so I can't go sort of deep into the difference. However, the World Health Organization has designated burnout as a syndrome, which is a different definition to that used for depression, which is a mental illness. And I think the delineation is important. There are some similar symptoms that can arise between burnout and depression, and there is some discussion among researchers as to whether there is a correlation or whether burnout, is a form of depression. But our feeling really reflects that of the World Health Organization, that there is a delineation and it's an important one, and that the cause of burnout really is the workplace. And so putting it in that organizational context, whereas depression can be an experience that we have long before we enter the workplace and in an entirely different sort of context with different physiological implications too.
Great, thanks so much for that explanation, Sally. The next question is for either of you, and it's coming from Warwick. And it's a question in regards to the statistic that 65% of people are not returning to the same industry. And are there any kind of certain industries that's kind of coming from? And are there any expectations that come with them, or more around that kind of statistic and where the problem sits?
I think I'll take that. I'll have a first stab at that one. I don't think there is some research on where I guess people are moving to in those within those stats. So, for example, financial services. That during this period where people were being retrenched and people were losing their roles within certain industries, they did a lot of conscious effort. They put a lot of conscious effort in doing recruitment for those within those industries. So, for example, they might need people with really good customer service capabilities, or really good with people. Well, you've got an entire hospitality airline industry with a lot of people with a lot of those same type of skills. And they had the foresight to be able to say, oh, actually, these are the same skills that we're looking for. So let's see if we can attract a lot of them into our industry. And I think certain industries were quite good about doing that. I mean, at the detriment of certain other industries, but they did have the foresight on, hey, let's think about not what they've been doing or what jobs they have, but what are the skills that we need for our organization moving forward? And they were able to kind of match that up and really move the people from one side to another.
Awesome. Thanks so much, John. So really coming back to that skill and the potential and what we're looking for there. The next question is from Nicole. And Sally, this is more of a personal question and asking about your initial experience. Nicole's wondering, what could your organisation have done differently when you're experiencing such high levels of workplace stress? Are there a couple of key things that kind of stick out for you there?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really great question, Nicole. I think one of the things that I found at the firm I worked for, but I think this goes probably more broadly within the legal industry, is that there's very little scope to push back at all. So I would be juggling multiple deadlines and multiple deals. I was we represent a lot of banks, so big financial transactions, And I would remember an incident of a partner coming to my office at about 9 o'clock on a weeknight and saying, "Do you have capacity?" And I said, "No." And he said, "I'll send it through anyway." So this kind of environment of really just not literally listening to people trying to set boundaries, and so that's one thing. Really, they could have done a much better job of sort of managing workload, and listening to the attempts for boundaries to be set. I think also rest was a really big part of it. I worked in a fairly young and energetic team, and I think through my 20s I was probably to some extent quite capable of getting away with that kind of behavior. But we would work 70 or 80-hour weeks for months at a time, and then maybe get a day off or a spa voucher, and that would be the extent of the rest allowed. So building in a lot of those things that we were speaking about in terms of you're really having some really solid policies around rest, and really enabling us to, I think, even within the space of our workplace, being able for our physiological system to take some rest as well. So we're not just draining ourselves at work and recovering on the weekend, but we're actually given the time within the framework of our work to recuperate and to have our parasympathetic nervous system engage so that we can find that balance. So we're actually able to go into our weekend fully energized, or into our holiday, energized and ready, rather than literally exhausted and sort of crawling to the airport.
Yeah, wow. So it sounds like absolutely some practical strategies in there that the workplace could have implemented. And, what really resonated for me there was just, actually listening and taking that feedback on board when you have kind of stuck your hand up and said, "No, I don't have any more capacity." And then really looking at how, that workload is managed, and the opportunity for rest and recovery. The next question, again, is for you, Sally, and it's from Carrie. And you mentioned the report through the presentation that you're working on and that will be released soon. There's just a question around, where will the report be published, and how can people access that?
Sure. So John and I are busy at the moment preparing the report. So the data that we've shared today is very fresh. And we're putting together a report along the lines of the one we did last year, and that'll be published in November, and it'll be available on the Infinite Potential website as a free download. And we can share that information with you after the session. I'd love to have you access and use the report in our sort of more explicit recommendations and our deeper analysis of the data. So we can share that with you for sure.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sally. We'll make sure that we get that out to our listeners today. There's a question from Tara, and she's asking around what your suggestion would be for leaders who do not follow up on these conversations. She's indicating that she thinks most people do not give up immediately, but then potentially quit when they get no support. So is there any practical things that you can maybe advise for our leaders out there around how they follow up and demonstrate that they have listened and that there's action?
One thing we talked about during last year's report was that there is a lot of hesitancy for our leaders to take the charge on this. There is not on any leader's responsibility to, hey, we want you to kind of fix the burnout problem. That is not something that's on any leader's KPIs or objectives. And we all understand how complex it is to be able to solve burnout. If we want to change a policy, that's going to involve the business, it's going to involve HR, maybe take just a whole bunch of people and so there's a lot of hesitancy on doing that, both because they're not being asked for it, they're not rewarded to do this, and frankly, it's just too hard for any one individual leader to kind of take on. Now, our recommendation really for leaders is start small within your own team. What can you do within your own team? And there will certainly be other leaders out there who will see the great work that you've been doing and want to kind of copy that. And once you get a couple of leaders doing similar things, you can really, what we kind of talked about in terms of a movement, that's when you really can start kind of growing that into something a lot bigger.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, John. So really looking at those kind of key drivers and movement and tackling it from a systemic perspective. And interestingly, you said there that not many leaders have, tackling burnout as a KPI, but I've actually been fortunate to work with an organisation recently where the CEO actually had that on their scorecard. So hopefully we can start to see a shift in this movement. There's a great question from Julian and one that kind of flagged for me listening as well. You indicated in some of the findings that for those people working from home 80% or more of the time that they were likely to experience higher rates of burnout. Just wondering, are there any kind of insights into what some of the key drivers might be for this?
Yeah, that's one piece that I'm really keen to kind of really dive into a little bit more. Like you mentioned earlier, what we're seeing is a causation, a correlation, but we don't know what's causing it. Is it because people who are burned out tend to work at home, or is working at home burning them out? Those type of questions. I will need a little bit more time to kind of digest the data to kind of figure out where that's going. But I kind of have if I were to kind of hypothesize now, I think this really goes into the hybrid work environment kind of conversation. Is there a balance between coming together, working in the same place, and also being able to work from home that is going to be optimal for our people? And what does that look like? I think there's a lot of discussion on that now, and hopefully, things like insights like this will kind of add to that conversation.
Fantastic. Thanks, John. So, maybe not any kind of robust analysis at this point in time to point to a couple of single things, but absolutely, a whole host of work being done there to try and understand that finding in more depth and detail. We've got a great question from Dominique around psychological job demands, and she's asked the question, are there any strategies for a workplace that requires high emotional demand from its workers?
Yeah, I think there are a few things, and I think this is one certainly through the pandemic where there's been quite a lot of research done into the psychological impact of working in very high emotionally stressful environments such as healthcare, particularly in the United States. There's been quite a lot of research coming out on that. While our research doesn't focus specifically on that, the recommendations I'd have would be basically along the lines of what we've discussed, but almost with a greater focus on two things. One is rest, really ensuring that your body, and give your body the time to physiologically recover from your work. And by rest, I don't just mean sleep, but I mean doing other things that are non-work that engage your parasympathetic nervous system and allow your body to come back to a state of ease. Another aspect is to talk about what's going on. So I think particularly in these psychologically stressful environments, we can grapple with a lot of these issues in ourselves. And one of the things that's also come out through my research around burnout prevention and recovery on an individual level is also the importance of talking about what we're going through with others. Now, whether that's with a trained professional, whether that's with a coach, a trusted friend, that's up to the individual, but I think it's a really key component of being able to retain a sense of objectivity and help us to make healthy decisions for our own health, including our mental health, because when we're under that chronic stress, as I mentioned, our vision becomes more narrowed and we can actually become less capable of making healthy, objective decisions. So I think those two key things, particularly rest and talking with someone you trust.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sally. And, that the criticality of recovery after highly emotionally demanding work is key, and that, that peer support and being able to engage with that trusted advisor. And I might throw in there, based on our experiences yesterday with the live stream, to maybe look out for the soon to be released code of practice and how organisations and workplaces can manage those psychosocial risks and hazards. I think, whilst I was listening to you spoke about the the importance of leaders modeling the right behaviour. And I know that as a leader within my organisation, I'm as guilty as most in terms of not modelling some of that behaviour at times, and maybe engaging in some unhealthy work habits. And absolutely, I've been known to, in the past, email out of hours. And I think, you mentioned in there, John, through the talk, that there are things like, rules that you can put in place in your email software to delay send. And some of the feedback that I've heard in the past is, well, then I open up my inbox on a Monday morning and suddenly at 8:45 I get 6 emails, and my work pressure has just gone up exponentially. So I'm just wondering, are there any other kind of tips or strategies that you have out there for leaders around modelling the right behaviour, and how can we go about doing that?
Yeah, that's such a great point. One thing when I work with leadership teams, one of the things that I kind of talk to them about is about being a lot more planful, and and also not being so reactive to certain things. I think there's a lot of times, especially when you get to a certain level, everything seems like it's a big thing that has to get done now, and we kind of want to react to that. By being a lot more planful and having a lot more kind of either policies or just the ways that we work, that can really help tone down sort of the urgency of all this. Is this actually urgent? That's something that needs to be done, and how does this fit into our overall kind of plan on doing this? If it's not something that needs to be done right now, maybe it doesn't. We'll fit that in when we're able. Another, I guess, more tactical tip that I've given some leaders is actually within the subject line. This sounds simple, but it's actually has been quite useful. Just have a vocabulary that you and your team uses. For example, the ones I use would be, this is for review by the action that you want this person to take, and the time, and the when is it due for that. By knowing, okay, so this is just FYI, I can read that whenever I have time, or maybe this is something for me to review and get done by the end of the week or something like that. By knowing when things are, I can put that into, or the people that you're sending email to can plan around that. And that just that clarity of communication is really important. It's really helpful for leaders to do.
Yeah, great. What a simple hack in terms of just that kind of assistance with prioritization, so that we can reduce those stress levels and reactions to the multiple tasks that we have to tackle. Sally, you mentioned throughout the presentation the criticality of psychological safety in the workplace, in terms of having a psychologically safe workplace and it being a mitigation strategy for burnout. As a leader or as an organisation, what can I start to do to build psychological safety within my team or within the organisation?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Mark. There's psychological safety is not something that we flick a switch and suddenly everyone's psychologically safe. And the term itself is sort of used as a kind of a team. It's something that occurs within the team. So it's a bit like a vibe. But I think one of the key strategies that we see as sort of being able to build psychological safety is to create connection with your different team members. So creating a sense of taking the time, for example, through one-on-one meetings to understand what they're going through in their lives, how their workload is, and really touching base with people. It's also as simple as, for example, opening a meeting, maybe a weekly meeting, having a quick chat about how everyone's weekend has been or how we're doing. That was something we particularly saw through the pandemic in remote work, that it was even more important to be asking people how they're doing, and also being vulnerable yourself in sharing if you're not doing well, if you're struggling. So creating that sense of vulnerability and safety to share. Another aspect is around mistake making. And this is one certainly in the legal industry that was a big one, because there's not a lot of room for mistakes. And when we don't have space to talk about errors that we've made or things that we've screwed up, that can really limit our creativity and innovation as well. So by talking about, for example, our own screw-ups, which we all have, with our team, but doing so in a way that sort of allows there to be an environment of people being willing to come forward and share if they have questions, and co-creating solutions, so that, this is something that a lot of the research shows really big disasters could have been prevented if the organization had a psychologically safe environment of the team itself. So there are different strategies. We'll also go into, I think, some recommendations for psychological safety in the report. But it's about connecting with people as humans, I think, as a starting point. And like I said, it's not something that suddenly in one meeting everyone's going to feel it. It really is an investment over a long term. And it means consistent behavior from a leader in terms of building a relationship of trust, of respect, and of being someone that the team can count on.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much for that, Sally. Such valuable insights. I like that idea that you can't just walk in and flick on the switch and suddenly you have psychological safety, and the importance of checking in with people, demonstrating that vulnerability, and as you mentioned, we're all human and we all make mistakes, and being able to kind of stick your hand up and say, I've done this and this is what happened, and kind of modeling that behavior. Some really great practical tips that people can take away. We've got a final question here from MJ, and MJ's indicated that he or she is a worker and thinks that I have burnout symptoms. What would you suggest I do next? I know a week off on holiday isn't going to fix the issue, so what can I do?
I'll go first, and really keen to hear, Sally, what you say as well. I think the first thing I would do is talk to your manager. A lot of times, a lot of leaders, while they have really good intentions, actually can't and don't pick up a lot of the signs that their people are really stressed and are burning out at the moment. So I really would recommend that you talk to your direct manager, and if there's some issues there, maybe somebody else, a peer of the manager, to really discuss. So what is how you're feeling, what's going on, and see if you can work out something to help alleviate some of that stress. As we kind of talked about, a lot of the burnout has to do with the organization and what it's doing to that person. So if you're able to kind of pinpoint, I've got too much work on at the moment, or I'm going to too many meetings, or whatever it is, work with your manager as the first step to see what you can do to alleviate some of that stress. At a more extreme kind of level, if you've gone through your manager and other leaders and it just doesn't seem like there is any other way, I would kind of recommend that see if you can look for something else first within the organization. But if it's something within the organization, be open about going somewhere else, because taking care of yourself is the most important thing.
Yeah, I'd fully agree. If I can just jump in and really underscore what John has said about talking as a first step. And in the Netherlands and in an increasing number of jurisdictions, actually, we are seeing legislation that allows people to take leave for burnout and other issues. And I think that's something that, while still imperfect here, it does really create that freedom to be able to say, I'm not okay and I need time, and really building in that opportunity to rest. For you, MJ, like my research and my book on burnout recovery, there's 4 steps that I would say are important. So if you take the vowels out of burnout, B, R, N, and T are left. So breathe, taking care of your physiological system, trying to start getting that parasympathetic nervous system activated again. Rest, however that is possible. Nourish, so really taking care of yourself and your body in whatever way that needs to happen. And T is talk. And as John mentioned, that as a first step, that for me is also the key step, because we can't deal with burnout. We can't really deal with anything until we acknowledge the reality of the situation. So by talking to someone, whether it is a manager or, again, a trained professional, starting that conversation also starts your journey to healing. And I think also at a broader level, by talking about it and creating that conversation, you're also maybe giving that manager or your team, people some feedback. There's some chronic stress going on here, and you're probably not the only one who's exposed to it. So it's really in your own interest, but I think also for your team members and the organisation you're in more broadly, a really powerful step to take. I hope that helps.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sally and John, for joining us this afternoon, for your insights, for sharing your personal story, and also the insights into your research and the practical tips and strategies that you've shared with our audience. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. And the presentation and the recording will be available on our website shortly. Keep an eye out for it in the coming weeks. As we wrap up the event today, you'll spot a QR code on screen. You're invited to confidentially share insights into the preferences, barriers, and drivers for your organisation in developing and implementing health and safety management systems that consider mental health and how you engage in mental health initiatives and programs. You can also go into the draw to win a prize, which is the delivery of mental health training for managers and supervisors in your workplace, which is valued at almost $1,000. Check out the website for other events happening during this month. There's plenty of resources on there, including the Mentally Healthy Workplaces Toolkit. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and remember, work safe, home safe.